Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, How to Secure Funding for Your Startup. Now, just before we get going, as a quick note, we are recording this session and we'll be sending it out to everyone who signed up. But for now, let's just get started. So first off, what does a PR company like Publicize for startups or PR company for startups know about startup funding? Well, that's a very good question. We've researched the funding landscape and interviewed key players within the startup investment world, from major accelerators and investment funds, including Seedstars, the Founder Institute, Startup Grind, and others. And not only that, we've also worked with hundreds of startups since we were founded in 2014 and helped many of them build their credibility and profile through PR and communications, which then helped them secure investment. And we've distilled some of the main takeaways for this research, into this webinar. My name is Eddie Arrieta. I'm the president and co-founder at Publicize, where we work with startups from a wide range of industries and from all over the world. At Publicize, we focus on PR strategies and tactics that are specifically geared towards growth, such as helping clients secure investment, grow their user base, or win more business. If you want to learn more about this, check out the resources center on our website. We have just shared on the chat section, but let's get to business. So this webinar, everyone, is divided into two main parts. The first part, I will run through a brief presentation on how to secure funding for your startup, which will go through the following points: typical stages of startup investments, finding investors, what investors expect to see, the pitch deck, managing the process. Then during the second half, I will be joined by Charlie Graham Brown, the CIO of Seedstars, who runs the world's biggest startup competition in emerging markets. He will be sharing his unique insights on startup funding, as well as answering any questions you post in the webinar chat. So everyone, get ready, let's get started, and we will have a great conversation with Charlie. So to begin with an overview and some context, I'm going to quickly run over the typical stages of startup investment. So the typical investment cycles for average startup look something like this. The initial investment, which is used to get things off the ground. Then you would have the pre-seed investment, which is used to develop a minimum viable product. Then we have the seed investment, which is used to find true market fit and grow. And investment and Series A investment, which is used to build scale. Series B and C and D and E and F and X and Y and all of those then occur after Series A, with each round building on the previous one. So that's the basics of it. And here are the typical investors and some investment you will find at each of these funding stages. So you can read this slide. As you can see, in initial, this typical investment varies depending on the founders and their background. Then you would have pre-seed, friends, families, fans, fools, and angel investors, anywhere between 10K to 250K. You'll have seed, up to 2 million from VCs and micro VCs, and then Series A from traditional VCs, anywhere between 2 million and 15 million. Then from there on, like we mentioned, these funding rounds will be building up on the previous stage. Now, the first part of the process is finding target investors. The sheer number of options can make this process bewildering. If you have no prior experience, which is why you need to approach this in a targeted way. So start by creating a hit list of target investors in a spreadsheet. That's very simple. You want to aim for at least 50 target investors if you are at the pre-seed or off-seed stage of investment. As realistically, it could take these many pitches to land an investment. Setting goals is also vital. So decide on a time scale for reaching out to each of these and trying to secure meetings with them. You want to find the most relevant and successful investors operating within your niche and close to your location. You can start this process by researching investors online. There are a ton of resources listing incubators, accelerators, and investors by industry verticals. You can also download our investor database that contains the details of hundreds of investors split by industries. Let me repeat that. You can also download our investors database that contains the details of hundreds of investors split by industries. And a link to this will be shared in the chat section of this webinar. You can then look at successful startups that have trod the path before you and find out who their investors are using. Platforms such as Crunchbase, and of course, leverage your professional network and talk to other founders operating within your space. Once again, if you have any questions on any of this, you can put it in the chat section of the webinar, and you can put it in the questions section of this amazing software that allows us to have this webinar. Now, you also want to be assessing potential investors that you're adding to your hit list. You can assess this in much more detail once you get to the stage of investors that have made offers. But at this stage, you should take a look at their investment methodology, their network and market access, their previous sector experience and success, and what ongoing support they can provide. So think about what you can get out of them. So this is a great way to assess that. Now, next up is understanding investors' expectations. So you can plan your pitches and interactions accordingly with them. At the pre-seed stage, this is all about demonstrating potential and the market opportunity. An MVP isn't generally required at this stage, but a proof of concept or a pre-launch with some limited users or customers is. So your tech can still be very basic at this stage. An investor would also expect the founder team to be working on the business full time and to have invested their own capital. So they know the founders are all in on it. So if you're not all in on it, rethink your life. Just kidding. It's a joke, people. As you move into the seed stage, an MVP is actually required. You also need to demonstrate that you have an experienced core team of perhaps 6 to 8 people who are capable of managing this stage of the business. On the revenue side of things, you need to show that you have the beginnings of revenue and user growth. So if you are B2B or you're a B2B company, 30 clients with a low churn rate could be enough to demonstrate this. Whereas if, for example, you're a B2C mobile app, at least a few thousand users would probably be required. Your growth projections and assumptions will also be very important here, and your ability to talk this language will be vital, such as discussing churn, monthly revenue, and growth accounting. When it comes to Series A funding, you need to have a fully functioning product. But not only that, you also need to show consistent revenue growth for at least the previous 6 months in order to prove the demand and scalability of your business. And you'll need to show that you've built a team that will deliver growth and enable you to scale. Now let's get talking about your pitch deck or investor decks. It's often the first interaction a potential investor will have with your startup. So getting this right is once again crucial. As someone once said, investors don't write checks for decks. So the goal is to use this to generate interest. Once again, I know we are going really fast through this information. Any questions you might have, chat section, question sections of this webinar. So let's move on. If what you're trying to do is to, of course, use this to generate interest of the investors, then you should tell a story, open up investors' mind to your vision and the opportunity it presents, and leave them wanting more. Something that you shouldn't do is try to answer every possible question containing too many financial details and provide false assumptions. This would just confuse them. Most pitch decks follow a standard structure in order to build a suitable narrative. At a high level, it looks something like what we are going to be showing you. So the first slide is for vision, which should be a one-liner that explains your product and vision. For example, Here at Publicize, we've democratizing PR for startups. Um, Slide 2 then would talk about your achievements to date, such as revenue, users, press coverage, and customer success story. Slide 3 then moves on to market opportunity, which explains what market you are in, what's your total market size, your place within that market, and who your product serves. And don't worry, we'll come back to this. If you have any questions, once again, write them down. Next up is an explanation of the problem you are solving. And current solutions offered within the market. Explaining these current solutions sets you up to explaining how your solution is actually better. Slide 5 is then explaining your product and how customers benefit from your solution. Try to make this more visual than relying on lots of text. Next up on slide 6 is your actual business model. Here you need to show how your product makes money, what your revenue has been to date. So show some high level numbers on revenue and potential conversions. Now on to slide 7, and here you need to explain your route to market. How will you capture your target customers and how this will enable you to achieve your growth? Slide 8 should provide an overview of how your team and key stakeholders, it briefly should explain everyone's background and how this makes them qualified to lead the company. And then on slide 9 is your 3 to 5 year financial model, which needs to show your critical assumptions such as expenses, customer conversion, churn, and market penetration. Your second from last slide talks about your competition. Here you really need to explain where you fit within the current market and what the advantages are of your product. And finally, the very last slide should be your ask. State how much capital you're raising and on what terms. What is the timing of this? And do you already have any notable investors? Also include some details on what the capital would be used for. So let's, of course, think about the following. So once you have assembled your investor hit list and created your pitch deck, you now need to manage the whole process. Let us make these connections again in our mind. We have an investors hit list. We have a prioritized list of people we want to contact. We have created a pitch deck, and now we need to start working on the process of contacting them. So the structure and term and timing are absolutely critical here. Nobody wants to buy a house that's been on the market too long. And the same can be said about investing in a startup that's been on the hunt for investors for too long. So you need to stick to a tight schedule, which can look something like this example here that you can see on our slide, 2 weeks, 4 weeks to close. During the first 2 weeks, you perform your outreach and meeting scheduling. Then over the following 4 weeks, you have your investors meetings and negotiations. Then in the final 4 weeks, you agree to close the deal. This is super ideal. Ideally, you're looking really to create an auction effect with a number of interested parties, and sticking to a tight timeline will help you absolutely do this. So when it comes to the outreach and scheduling meetings with investors, introductions and referrals are still key. So using your investors hit list, mind your network for people who have existing relationships with any of these investors, or people within your network who have people within their network who have these relationships. Make it easy on the person you're asking the introduction from by explaining why your business would be a good potential investment for the investor you're trying to meet. And finally, follow up immediately on any introductions with a brief one-page pitch and request a meeting. Just as vital as managing your time is managing rejections. Having a few dozen meetings over a couple of weeks and hearing no after no, it's tough and can grind even the most resilient people down. So you need to approach it with the right mindset and game plan. Plan to hear rejections during your first few meetings. So line up less significant investors first. This takes the pressure off and helps you refine your pitch as you start meeting more significant investors. And remember, Getting to the point where an investor tells you no is an achievement in itself, and it took a lot of hard work just getting there. Bearing this in mind can help you stay motivated during those tough periods. Now, going back to what I said at the very start of the webinar, we are a peer agency for startups, and we've helped support many of our clients when we've been seeking investments. So you're probably wondering, what's the role of PR in all of this? So, of course, good PR and media coverage by itself isn't going to secure you investment, but what PR does is publicize all of the great things your business is doing, which in turn builds your credibility and exposure. Your pitch to investors is you telling them in your own words why your business or product has enormous potential. But if you win press coverage that builds and supports this narrative, your pitch becomes a lot stronger. So some specific outputs of PR that can aid you during your funding process include building your digital footprint. What people find when they search for you and your company plays a big part in forming their first impression of you. And it's no different with investors. If you have high profile media coverage on page one of Google, when someone searches your name on your company, then that helps to build a positive image. It also highlights your growth and momentum. If you're already secured funding at a previous stage of development, or being through an accelerator, or taking on top talent, PR publicizes this for you, which helps to build an image of growth and momentum, which is actually real. It's not something that you're making up. And all of this establishes your thought leadership, such as via guest articles and high-profile media, as well as speaking engagements. These in turn helps to build your credibility and authority within your industry. That was very productive. I hope everyone is enjoying this as much as I am. So that's the end of the first part of the webinar, which we went really quickly. So just before we move on to the questions and answers section with Charlie, which I hope he expected this was coming this fast. So if you want to access a database of incubators, accelerators, and investors to get you going with that first step we were talking about, download our ebook, The Ultimate Startup Accelerator and Investor Database. You heard it right, the ultimate Startup Accelerator and Investor Database, using the link in the webinar chat. Our amazing team has been able to create this amazing resource. So a big shout out to everyone who has helped build this ultimate startup accelerator and investor database. So question time. It's time for your questions. And we, of course, are gathering these informations. But right before that, I'm delighted to be joined by Charlie Graham Brown, CIO at Seedstars. So he's an investment manager, business developer, and entrepreneur focused on emerging and developing markets, responsible for products acceleration and investments at Seedstars. So, of course, we have a few questions already created for Charlie, and I'm going to be going over them. So, just as you guys are putting some of those questions, so when it comes to all stages of funding, growth projections are clearly vitally important. What are the key figures that startups need to present aside from pitch decks and projections? What are investors looking for within founders themselves? What type of diligence requirements do you witness causing issues when startups are going through investment rounds and all of that? So if we can get Charlie, of course, with us today, we're going to be able to get some answers to this. So bear with us for a few seconds.
Hello. Good evening. Good morning.
Charlie, how are you doing?
Very well, thanks.
Really great to be able to touch base. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today at Publicize, and thank you so much for answering the questions from the people in the audience.
Happy to be here.
Oh, great. Charlie,
Thank you.
why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself from your own words? Sometimes these
Yeah,
introductions are made and then people are like, that doesn't define me. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now
sure.
and where you are?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, cut a long story short, let's go quickly. I was an engineer once upon a time. I then moved into the financial world in sort of traditional finance. Then I went into impact investing, so covering purely emerging markets. I got the entrepreneur itch, like I guess everyone on this call. Did a few of my own startups, raised a bit of capital, fell out with founders, made some mistakes, and then joined Seedstars, which is or was 6 years ago. It's itself a startup working for startups in emerging markets. And so basically, Seedstars, I'm one of the partners. So there's 6 of us who kind of founded and have grown and made Seedstars what it is today. And Seedstars, in a very short sentence, is basically a full stack VC for emerging markets, as you said. So we do all kinds of different things for the entrepreneurial ecosystems in emerging and developing markets. So anything from acceleration, pre-acceleration, post-acceleration, hackathons, events, co-working spaces. So really a whole bunch of different products. And then obviously we have the investment side and the investment activity as well.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for that introduction. We have several questions, so I hope you have the time to
Definitely.
answer these questions. I'm
Yeah,
going to get
absolutely.
started with one of the ones that we have planned. So when it comes to all stages of funding, growth projections are clearly vitally important. So what are the key figures that startups need to present from your perspective?
Sure. So I would say actually that you should spend more time on measuring and having data for your current metrics rather than like future projections. It's important to go through the process of doing a financial plan, a financial model, just because it make sure you understand the drivers of your business, and you're going to be asked for it, and if you don't have it, you probably look a bit silly. But I would downplay somewhat the importance of that and rather answer this question about the data and the metrics you should have today for your business. And I think that's often done badly. And I would give the advice of breaking it down into basically 3 different sections. You should all have a North Star metric. You should all have one metric that your whole company is tied to, that you set your big, hairy goals to each year, and that you can communicate with very clearly internally and externally. So everyone should have that North Star metric, and you should be able to pull up data on it, on a daily, weekly, minute by minute basis if asked to do so. And then from that, it kind of cascades down, and the next level would be your kind of top level KPIs and drivers. So, maybe we should have an example. So if we're talking about a e-commerce marketplace, your top level KPI is probably going to be on GMV. But then from there, your top level KPIs are going to be things like number of orders or average order size or abandonment rate, things like that directly impact your KPIs. So that impact your North Star metric. So North Star metric, top level KPIs and drivers, and then going into the sort of funnel where you can really break down. So the funnel for e-commerce would be probably ads. And so for those ads which are part of the acquisition funnel, you have certain metrics like your click-through rates or your CPA. From there, you see how many convert and how many acquire or purchase. You see how many abandon, and so you basically have your metrics all the way through the funnel. So I would prioritize getting that right versus doing a projection that is accurate to the nearest dollar, because projections, everyone knows that you're going to get them wrong. You have to do them because it is a good exercise, and it probably will teach you or uncover certain things about your business in the future that you hadn't thought of. But I would first get the sort of current growth metrics right.
Okay, awesome. So if we're working on like our pitch deck, and it's very interesting because when you're talking about like the North Star metric, it almost seems to me that if you get that wrong, it doesn't matter how well you did the rest of the exercise,
True.
it would not make a lot of sense. Is there
Yeah.
something that you can tell us about some North Star metrics that you have seen out there that can help kind of like inform that sort of process? What are some of those that you can
Yeah.
point to?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. If you get the North Star metric wrong, and it is common to go through some iterations, and it's not just something you can, well, for some businesses it's easier than others, but it generally takes a bit of thinking, and sometimes you'll change it over the course of time. But it is important to have it right, otherwise, yeah, the things that cascade from that make less sense. So basically, I mean, the North Star metric should be tied almost directly to your revenue. It doesn't have to be revenue, but it should be, very close to and kind of a key driver of your revenue. And it should also be directly related to the core value proposition that you're offering your customers. So, if we take the e-commerce example again, it's probably going to be something along the lines of, completed orders. You might want to go a step further though, because if you're in a business that has tons of returns, you actually, you might want to have non-returned orders or something like that. So you have to think, what is the key thing directly related to revenue and the core value. For other industries, Airbnb, I think they have nights booked. So rather than number of properties or revenue or something like that, what they're really trying to provide is nights booked, and so that's what they track. For marketplaces, working with a couple of companies right now, they're sort of doing marketplaces for doctors or therapists and things like that. So for them, it's going to be completed sessions. And they say completed because they find often, people book a session, but then they'll cancel before it's actually due. And, all of those cancellations cause them, it's an operational challenge. So they want to reduce that. And so their North Star metric is one step further, and it's basically the completed sessions. So yeah, you have to think quite carefully about it.
Okay, excellent. And I think, some of the vibe that I'm getting from your answer is, and I know like from myself as an entrepreneur, sometimes we might be overthinking things, and then we create all these very complex like metrics, and we're saying, oh, our North Star is the ratio between this and that, and like it just becomes very complex. In general, like when you see these North Star metrics, do you find that they are something very simple to
Yeah,
understand and get and
definitely.
communicate? And like when you see a lot of complexity on those, do you generally think it's probably wrong, or are there
Yeah.
instances where they can get very complex? What is your insight on that?
No, I think it should be definitely simple. So yeah, I mean, I was talking with someone the other day as well, like what their North Star metric was, and they were, thinking, okay, it has to be active, but then, like active users, and they were trying to define the time period. And, again, it was just getting too complex, and there was too many conditions around it. And in the end, it came back to, they were an ed tech platform, and it came back to something along sort of completed courses. So yeah, I mean, it's just thinking through, okay, what's the core value, and how do I measure that? And I think if you keep that in mind, then you do tend to come up with something simple.
Yeah, I think that's great insight. Thank you so much. I think one of the other questions that we have prepared that I think might be a good segue here to make is what type of due diligence requirements do you witness causing issues when startups are going through investment rounds, and how can other startups avoid these problems? Of course, if the first thing you see is that they don't have a clear North Star, that's gonna be the first due diligence problem, I guess. But I'm trying to understand how we can interpret the
Yeah,
due diligence process, and I presume that changes from firm to firm. So,
sure.
what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, to get into well, so due diligence has many steps, and the first meeting with an investor is technically part of their due diligence, but they just don't call it that. And a pitch you might do to them on stage as part of a demo day, or like all of these things are kind of part of anyone's decision making, and due diligence is really just a decision making process. But I guess if we talk formally about, normally investors say they're doing, you're under due diligence when they've already decided to a certain level of committing money capital to your company. So it's already after the first meetings, you've done your pitches, you've sent them some follow-up material, and then they say, okay, we're going to do due diligence. So for me, if you haven't already passed the pitch and you haven't already had your North Star metric clear in the pitch deck and so forth, I think, you'd already have had issues. They wouldn't be in the formal due diligence. But you're right, like one of the formal due diligence requests is typically send us your KPI dashboard. And that's not something you can pull together in a day. It takes a lot of time to get it right, to get the data. It's a big effort. And obviously, a KPI dashboard goes through various versions. It starts off as a spreadsheet, fairly simple, and then it becomes a data studio or a Tableau or another kind of SaaS tool, which is much more complex, or something you've built custom made. But I think on that question, I mean, the one thing, so due diligence for me it's really just an investor looking inside all of your files. And so if you want to get due diligence right, you just have to have your house in order. It's just basic kind of housekeeping. You need to have all of your documents. You need to have, if you've done investment agreements, one of the common things is, you all sign it and then you forget to scan it, or you have one signature but you didn't scan it when all the signatures were there, and you only have that version, and the other one it's somewhere, but it's going to take you an hour, or you're never going to find it because it's in an old email address. So it's just about getting all of that documentation in order. And if you do it as you go, like if you're just a little bit organized all the way through the life of your company, due diligence will be a bit of a doddle, because everything will be there and you just, okay, look inside this drive or this folder and you have everything you need. I mean, the basic concept is just make sure you have everything organized. The other stumbling block, though, that I would flag is about the legal structure. One of the big hurdles I see is companies have set up, and this is very common in emerging markets especially. So in the US, I mean, it's easy. Everyone has a Delaware C Corp, and there's no, everyone has the same thing, and it's just easy. In emerging markets, so I know I think there's some companies from Colombia, for example. Generally, people start off with a local entity, but then they'll, for whatever reason, set up a Delaware company or a Cayman Islands or BVI, which is absolutely fine. It can be to have multiple subsidiaries and to centralize everything. It can make country internationalization simpler. It can be for many reasons, because the investors ask for it, because that's what they're comfortable with, the rule of law. There's many reasons to do it. The problem is if you have like a multiple companies and they're not cleanly structured, it takes a lot of time to clean everything up, and it also costs you a lot of money. So it's pretty simple. Your holding company needs to hold 100% of your subsidiaries. And there needs to be a clear shareholding agreement and service level agreement, or whatever there needs to be, royalty agreement, license agreement. If you don't have that structure organized, it's going to take you 6 months to clean it up, and during that time, the investor can't put money in, and that is a really kind of common problem I see.
That's really good insight, because it seems like if you're not taking care of a lot of these things, like if you are hoping to have a specific timeline, when you realize all the work that's there, you're probably delayed by a year or 6 months in the best case scenario. And this is really cool, because Danny was asking about due diligence, and I really love the way in which you put it. Because you said like it's a decision-making process. And I presume that what the startup and the company is trying to do is to make the decision-making process for that investor as easy as possible. And that means have everything that they might require to take that decision as easy as possible. And when you're taking that decision, this will lead me to a question that Sam made. And Sam made this question, but I'm gonna reframe it a little bit. when you are talking to investors that are trying to take a decision on your startup, is it bad etiquette to mention to investors, other investors that are showing interest? Is this kind of like a game that you could play? How would you suggest you professionally approach this?
I mean, it it is a bit of a game, I would say, but you need to play it very carefully, and if you over kind of pitch the other investors looking at your company, and a few weeks later or months later you have nothing to follow up with that claim, it just puts you in a worse position in the end. So there is definitely, like, I think it's human nature, no one really likes to go first. So there is definitely a kind of follow the leader and this kind of sheep mentality in the investment space, like, no doubt. I mean, actually, some funds and some VCs, like, they even state that that's their mandate. It's like, we don't lead, but if you have a lead investor, we'll follow. I mean, so I'm not, what I'm saying, I don't think is really taboo or anything. It's, some people just structure themselves like that. Leading around, it's also a lot of work. If you're the first one in and you're putting in the most money, you're doing the full due diligence, there's more responsibility on your shoulders. You're probably taking a board seat. So finding a lead investor is that wasn't the question at all, but anyway, finding a lead investor
It works. It works.
is really a challenge. But having other investors, ready to follow, even, it definitely adds value. So even if you have people saying, look, I won't lead, but I'll put in whatever, 10%, 20%, 30% of the round, like, that in itself is definitely ammunition or arguments that you would use with your lead investor search. So there is a huge value behind having other people interested, and you should absolutely mention that. I mean, it's also so it comes down to credibility, and you need to build credibility with the other investor by showing you have these other leads, and not burn your credibility by lying and exaggerating. But it's also, for a lead investor, we want to know that you have a pipeline of investors, because there are some investors who take the whole round, but it's quite, well, depends. It's rare, I would say, in emerging markets at least. So you need, as a founder, to have a pipeline of other investors. So as an investor, I would want to ask you, how is your pipeline? And I'd want to know you've done your work, and you have, if you're in edtech, all of the edtech investors. So doing your homework is just part of that, building credibility.
Excellent, and I want to dig a little bit deeper, because it wasn't the question, but it was a fantastic answer. So getting to know this a little bit about what lead investors look like, and like that dynamic, because it seems like it's almost like you got a trust team that believes in what you're doing, and then you have someone in there that trusts you more than the rest, and perhaps you could have a couple lead investors. How does it work? Is it usually one lead investor, and then followed by a few others? What is the dynamic there?
I mean, it's well, in early stage funding, it's typically one lead, and I mean, it can go various ways. So at an angel round, and even at a seed round, you don't have to have a lead investor, I would say. At an angel round, well, maybe not 100% true. So at an angel round, it can happen with a formal business angel network, that one of the angel investors is the lead investor. And in more, like, I guess, experienced angel networks, that's how it typically works. So there'll be one angel investor who's the lead investor, and then 3 or 4 others who will also put in money, but they'll rely on the lead investor to do the due diligence. You could also do an angel round where it's just 4 individuals, they don't know each other, they all put in 50K, and no one is really the lead. They're just trusting you because they know you, and so forth. Can happen the same thing at the seed round. You can do it without a lead. But I guess when you get to Series A, it's much more common that there's one VC putting in the money probably first, but also, or committing first, but also committing to be on the board, and generally doing a full due diligence, while the others maybe do something a bit lighter. So yeah.
All right. So let's get on to because I have a bunch of questions that are mostly related to when you are actually doing the pitch. And I presume, of course, as you were mentioning, this is a decision making process. So it's not like you have one conversation and it's done. It's almost like you're always it feels to me that you're always kind of pitching at different stages in different areas. But what is the optimal duration if we are, first time we're talking about my business, like, is this something that, okay, 30 seconds is enough? Like, these people are talking about elevator pitches, but I presume if you're an investor and you think this is interesting, you could be there for hours if you really think this is something that was worth your time.
Yeah.
How does it work for you in terms of like spending time listening to an idea?
I mean, there's all different. There's not one answer to that, and I mean, it really depends on the format. So sometimes if you're at a pitching event, it'll be defined for you. So it'll be, okay, you have 1 minute or 3 minutes or 5 minutes. And that's what we typically use. So if it's at an event, it's going to be defined for you. If you've set up a meeting with an investor and you have an hour's meeting, I mean, that whole hour is basically the pitch. Typically, though, to structure that conversation, I would recommend that you have your pitch deck, and the first kind of 5-10 minutes, you do most of the talking and just give him the full picture, and from there, then it just becomes Q&A. But you have to adapt to the investor you're sitting in front of. So if it's an investor who's, let's say, experienced and has seen your type of business many times, in 10 seconds, you tell him, we're a doctor telemedicine marketplace. He doesn't really need to see the pitch because he knows what that is. But anyway, you should probably still, first 5 minutes at least, to give him the understanding, okay, this is what you do, this is the traction, this is our revenue model, our pricing. You give them the kind of 360 basics, and then from there, it's better that they lead the discussion, or lead the discussion, no, but at least lead the questions and ask what they want to ask, because everyone has their own thought process, and you need to give them time to ask their questions and get the answers they want. So yeah, there's not really a right answer for that one.
Okay, great. I have a question from Mirjana Perkovic. And it's related to what you're talking about. You're saying you have to adapt to the different investors. So what type of investor are you, Charlie? and what influences your decision? Is this something subjective? And there is a very objective component to it. I presume it has to be. We're talking about business, but how much is subjectivity part of it? And what type of investor are you? How should we approach you, for example?
So I think there was one of the other questions that you had up at the start, about what we kind of look for, and yeah, I mean,
I think, sorry to interrupt, but because I think the question is, what are investors looking for within the founders themselves, not in the numbers, but in the founders themselves?
Yeah, so it's kind of linked to that. What I was going to say. I mean, so I think investors all have their own kind of process, and we all break a company down in our own way, but I guess the components that we all look at are very similar. It's just everyone has their own process. Some people use scoring. Some people, they use it. They have a much more open structure, so it adapts to any business. So there's really different ways of doing it. There's VCs these days trying to do everything purely on data, or 90% on data, and remove that subjectivity that you mentioned. So I think those criteria, and there's probably a lot of literature on them, about the team, about the traction, about the technology, about the market size, the competition. It's the slides that you're going to have in your pitch deck, and those for sure are the key things that people are going to dig into. And then we talked about the legal side of it and the admin and everything. I think the one one thing that remains subjective that I can pinpoint for you is related to the founders. So that's why it's kind of related to that first question. And it's what I would call emotional intelligence. And it's this very sort of soft skill set that I think most, or a lot of people probably don't even realize that they're judging someone by. But yeah, I mean, we try and define it, and we also try and measure for it. So this emotional intelligence, which is things like, does the CEO have, and I'll talk about the CEO, but it kind of cascades on for the co-founding team. Does the CEO or the founding team have a real passion for the sector that they're working in? Do they appear coachable? Are they open to learning? And do they come across as arrogant, or do they come across as confident and ambitious? So there's those very soft emotional intelligence related factors that are hard to pinpoint, but definitely make up an important part of any decision, because it's actually the thing you'll judge first. And it's that judging a book by its cover, unfortunately. But in the first few minutes of a meeting, if the CEO doesn't come across as confident enough, or passionate enough, or whatever, the investor in the back of their mind, it's just going to switch something off, and that'll be it. You won't get it a second meeting. And I think it's probably something you can work on, and I don't know of anybody who does. So my advice would be, work on that, and simple things like, practice pitching to someone first, and give them some criteria. Say, look, be really honest with me. Do I come across as arrogant? Do I come across as confident? Do I come across as passionate? Ask them to be really honest, and I think you can learn a lot from that, and improve on that sort of more subjective side of the decision making. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And I think that answers Danny's question, where he was asking, like, what are some hot tips for first-time pitch? It's like, start thinking about whether or not you actually sound like you think you sound. Seems like a very interesting first step to be taken in there. And Mariana actually asked a follow-up question that also Teresa wanted to know more about, which is, what would be your advice for female entrepreneurs? And I know you've given already a lot of advice that still applies to female entrepreneurs pitching. And I think this is kind of like the essence of the question, pitching to mostly male investors. So I presume there is a controversial topic in there of, is there actually a difference when a female entrepreneur pitches to male entrepreneurs? And are we measuring people with different frameworks? And perhaps for Seedstars, that's not even a question, but we could agree that perhaps it is a question for other contexts in the world. And I think I'm opening there like 1,000 things. So I'm going to leave it up to you to give us your insight in whichever way you want to do it.
It's a really good question. I don't think I've ever had that one before. So
that's great. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm going to have the best answer, because I would love to give that some more thought, actually, and try and share some insights for future female founders, because it is a really good question. I'm obviously going to say this, but it doesn't influence our decision in any way. So I don't see it as a hurdle, because we're already kind of, I guess, playing in pioneering markets, in emerging developing markets. So you can't limit yourself, and there's not such a huge history of, I guess, a male dominant VC industry, even though those statistics are kind of similar to more developed markets. But yeah, I think you're right to say, there shouldn't be a difference. You shouldn't approach it different. I think you should, the things I was talking about, emotional intelligence before, are highly valid. If you come across as confident versus arrogant, if you show passion and ambition in the sector, you've shown that you can hustle, and you can get yourself, get your MVP or get your first funding, whatever it might be. I think all of those things applies to both male and female. I mean, there is this, for sure, there's studies on this, and there's biases, and people kind of not putting the images of the founders in the pitch deck because it's obvious it's a woman, and if you just have the name, maybe there's a bit of ambiguity if they don't pay attention. So there for sure is biases in the industry, but honestly, I don't know if you can avoid that, and I don't know if you would want to trick someone anyway into a first meeting. And I guess it does limit your options as a female founder, but I mean, I hope there's more sensitivity towards this. There's women VC WhatsApp groups, even in Africa. There was someone showing me the other day, like a woman investor group, and there was hundreds of people even in an emerging region like Africa. So there's definitely more sensitivity to this, and so if you are having issues, I would look towards those kind of VCs as well. VCs and angel networks that are primarily run by women, and their objective is to support women founders.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think a big part of this also is going to come to this understanding of like, why am I being rejected? And we could, as entrepreneurs, find and justify different reasons why perhaps we are being rejected. And we might say, oh, it's because I'm Colombian, or it's because I'm a Latino, oh, it's because I'm a female, or it's because about this. And this is a question that Sean was asking. Are there any tips, and I presume like at the very high level, that can allow you to deal with a lot of rejections? And you've said there are two main things. It's like, hey, you need to, when you are passionate and you care about this, that you need to show that through your emotional intelligence, and that has to be backed up by like actual data and information. Are there some tips in there that can allow you to, once you are in a place where you are confident about what you want, and you have the data to support it, but you're getting like constant rejections, what sort of mindset would you recommend entrepreneurs that you will be mentoring in a process like this?
Yeah, so I mean, rejection, whether it's for sales or fundraising or anything else, or rejection or failure, I mean, it's a part of a startup, because a startup is built on hypotheses that you then have to go and prove, and a lot of it is unfortunately trial and error. So with regards to fundraising specifically, I would say that you need to try and learn what you can from the rejections. So really, if it's not always possible, but if you can get the reasons for the rejections and get some feedback, really try and take the time to dig into that. And if you find you've got 3 rejections and it's all because something about the market sizing, really take the time then to think about that before you pitch the fourth person. So use it as a kind of learning and education process, which I would say is also a strategy, or leads you to a strategy of not starting with the first investors that you would like to have on your cap table. Start with ones that are maybe less important and second tier, so that you get the rejections maybe and the learnings from them before you move on up to your top targets. So there's definitely a bit of practice involved, like anything, and so yeah, use that experience. I mean, then there's a reality. If you've had so many rejections and they're all for very good reasons, it probably means you need to pivot or you need to change something. That said, there's always the inverse of that. People have had hundreds of rejections, and then they've become huge unicorns and so forth. So there is definitely something in persistence. And then I guess it's a similar mindset, but more related to just how you approach hypotheses in general and how you try and prove them. So like I said, your startup is full of hypotheses, whether it's about the pricing, or whether it's about the distribution channel, or the type of ads that are going to work, or the real value people want. Like it's hundreds of hypotheses, and we really try and teach this mindset of experimentation. And any failure is a learning, and as long as you're learning from those failures, you're progressing.
Any learning is a failure. That's a. I'm gonna. We'll use that quote definitely in our social media to promote this. You
Any
are
failure is a learning, not a.
any failure. Any learning is a failure. Any failure is a learning. Let's get it right. So you are usually on this side of the rejections. So I was just curious as you were explaining, how to approach the rejections and all of that. What are your traditional quote unquote rejection lines? What are some of the things that you use to say it's not you, it's me?
Uh, yeah, it's something I would say I would still like to do more, because I know the value of giving that like direct and honest feedback is essential for an entrepreneur. So it's something actually we're working on, like how to fluidify that process, because if you have 6,000 applications a year, it becomes quite hard to give individualized feedback. But we're working on something, because I really think there is a value behind that for the founders. There are hundreds, or not hundreds, maybe 50 or 60 common reasons that we give, and I can't really go through them all, but I think the most common one it comes down to the stage. And a lot of rejections are because startups are pitching to an investor who is not targeting the stage that you're in. So we're kind of working with startups who it's seed stage, but they should be revenue generating, maybe 10K monthly recurring revenue minimum. And then you have startups pitching you, then they're not even MVP stage, they're still idea stage. So that's just like 80%, I imagine, of anyone's deal flow is just because of the stage. And then from there, there are hundreds and hundreds of reasons. I suppose number 2 or 3, and maybe the top 3, 4, 5, I would say is probably going to come down to the team, and not having a CTO in-house is one of the common ones, or not having the tech in-house. If you're building a tech company, it's a pretty big hurdle. Hasn't stopped us from doing investments where there isn't a CTO, but it makes it a lot harder. And then the final one, I guess, it's just the market. If it's not something that we can get excited about, and we're not 100% impact focused, but we like startups that are solving real problems that are big problems for society. So if someone comes to us with, so one the other day, a kind of sports related app for booking football pitches, something like that, it's not really something that we're going to get super excited about. So there's that sort of sector fit, and maybe also in that case market size. So those are some of the key kind of rejection criteria.
Great. So, and you partially answered this, and I was really curious. I would put it in my notes to be one of the final questions. You have talked about sector feed. You've talked about impact. You've talked about like revenue. If to the people that are listening to this and will download this, if they have to run a checklist in their brains of like when to potentially pitch Seedstars, what does that checklist look like? So sector alignment, impact. Is there anything else we could tell people that are listening to this?
Yeah. So for us, the first ticket is kind of 50K to 250K. So it's in that stage that I mentioned. So revenue of, let's say, 10,000 monthly recurring, a team that is ready to invest in growth. So probably a 5-person team or upwards, where you can really start having resources dedicated to focus on growth. And then sector wise, most of our portfolio is either in fintech, health tech, ag tech, ed tech, and then there's a little bit of everything. So we have some, prop tech and have some sort of commercial and e-commerce and things like that. But the 4 sectors I mentioned to begin with, those are the core ones in our portfolio.
Okay, thank you so much, Charlie. I know that we are almost at a time, but we have two more questions. I hope it's okay if we can answer
Sure.
them. So Connor has a question, and this is interesting because it affects public size. So he asks, in terms of brand and like PR, you get these very passionate entrepreneurs, and then they have some data to show. How does the brand and like the PR that's out there and like what people are saying on articles like affect your decision making, your due diligence process? Does it help? Does it help kind of like lubricate the conversation? Is there any benefit to it?
There's definitely some benefit, and it comes back to what we were talking about before around credibility. If a journalist has taken the effort to write something about you, gives you some credibility. If a corporate sees that piece and gets in touch, because if you're B2B, let's say, and because of that you have a corporate partner, that's another client, and it builds credibility. So there is some value in it. I wouldn't put too much effort on that unless it's really a good way for you to generate leads, not from an investment perspective, but from a client perspective.
Great. So the final question, and I think it's kind of like a multi-part question, and with this we will end, I promise. So Midiana, again, is asking a really good question. So from the startups that you have met and the startups that you have perhaps invested on, how were you introduced to them? Was it a referral? Did they apply through a system? What did that look like? And of course, the final kind of like segue to that is, where do then people find you, and do you want to be found for that matter?
Sure. Yeah, so our primary sourcing channel is through what we call Seedstars World. It's a global startup competition we do in about 80 ecosystems all around emerging markets. So, across LATAM, across Africa, Middle East, Asia, Central Eastern Europe. That's our primary sourcing channel, and startups, anyone can apply to that competition. But there is also a lot of referrals coming into that competition. So, local accelerators, local VCs, local angels, they all make referrals into that competition, but anyone is absolutely welcome to apply. And from a kind of more direct investment point of view, so that's typically like a track where startups go through the competition, and then afterwards into our post acceleration program and investment. For direct investments, it's definitely more through referrals. But anyone is welcome to contact us, absolutely.
Excellent, Charlie. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. If we get any like follow-up questions, we'll make sure to send those over and maybe respond them over Twitter or whatever. Anyone else who is interested in the Seedstars World competition, you can go to seedstarsworld.com. So that's again seedstarsworld.com, and feel free then to apply. That's the first call to action on that website. Charlie, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much. Thanks for all the questions, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye, Charlie. We will be sharing once again this webinar recording over email to everyone who signed up. If you have any questions, find us at publicize.co, and you can find me, Eddie Arrieta, the president and co-founder of Publicize, at Fish Edinson in Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us, and bye-bye.